And welcome back to our Bible class looking at the hard words of Jesus. Maybe once we get that switch back and my clicker will work. We'll have to see. I think we've got about 4 chapters left to cover in the book, and we've got 3 weeks to do it in. So we'll see how we combine things. All right. And so today we're looking at Matthew 5:43 to 48, where Jesus says, "We be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect." So, all right, and so here's where Jesus is saying this in Matthew chapter 5. Can someone read this for us?
You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
All right, thank you. So be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So you got to hit the bullseye.
And there's no way.
Right. All right. So again, what do we learn when we're looking at these hard sayings of Jesus? What's the first thing to do? Look at context. Remember who Jesus is talking to. Who remembers who Jesus is talking to in Matthew 5? Anyone remember?
His disciples.
Yeah. So this is the part of Matthew 5 through, it's at least 7, if not 10, is the Sermon on the Mount. So again, so it's to his disciples and to those who are curious, those are at least are open to hearing Jesus teaching. So he's not talking to hostile priests, hostile scribes, hostile Pharisees. Because again, when we've looked at some of the hardest sayings of Jesus, it's because he's talking to people who don't like him, who are looking to trip him up. And so he's fine. He feels okay being a little harsher with them, I guess, to try and get through to them than to when he's dealing with the curious, with those open to his teaching. And so when he's demanding perfection, he's not. This isn't a challenge to the Pharisees who think they're perfect and aren't, but instead it's talking to those curious, to his disciples. All right. So kind of then thinking about it, are you a perfectionist? Any of you perfectionists? I think we were just talking about what?
Somewhat, yes.
Somewhat, okay.
As a result, I often don't even tackle a project
Bingo.
because
Yes.
there's no way I can get it done right.
Right. Do you struggle to accept being second best at anything? Are you afraid to fail? Are you extremely critical of mistakes? Do you obsess over things that didn't go the way you wanted? Do you become defensive if someone points out deficiencies in your work? Do you feel crushed if you're not a top achiever? Do you procrastinate? Do you think almost perfect is a failure?
Did you get that from my therapist?
But no, I mean, so first thing is to recognize is that, a lot of us are thinking that in terms of when Jesus says be perfect. Well, shoot, I'm already a perfectionist, but it comes with all these negative things. Of course, we see that, in older people, certainly see that in college kids. Oh shoot, I don't have a 4-point this semester. I don't know, I can handle this. I remember a few years ago, Jeff Sessler used to be an academic advisor for the athletic department, some of the teams. He said it was hardest to deal with the students who were high achievers. Like the athletes who, struggle, you have to push to go to class, those, you're used to. It's the ones who think they can do everything. Oh, sure, I can take 18 credits during my on season. When we're traveling, across the country every weekend, at least, or if not more, those kind of things. The perfectionists were the hardest ones to work with sometimes. And again, you you get these high achieving college students come here, and then suddenly they encounter calculus or organic chemistry or something like that, and encounter students that are as smart as they are, that they haven't necessarily been around. That can be a challenge growth experience, and so. When we're dealing with our perfectionism, we want to hear Jesus say this, that he'll say, 6 chapters later in Matthew. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That's the message we want to hear if we're perfectionists and struggling with that. That's the message we usually want to hear, not Jesus saying, well, be perfect as my Father is perfect. All right? So what's going on here? Well, again, Sermon on the Mount is Jesus kind of teaching his original audience, the disciples and those curious, but also then ultimately us, how to think and conduct ourselves as disciples of Jesus, teaching the standard of Christian living. Elsewhere in Matthew chapter 5, we've gotten it starts off with the Beatitudes. The blessed are the poor, the meek, those who mourn, all those sorts of things. It also doesn't sound like things we want to be, but things we are. Then he goes into some of those struggles with sin that we've talked about elsewhere in this book. If you get angry at your brother, that's worth sending you into hell. If you're lusting, cut out your eye. Those kind of things. So we're dealing with how to live out our lives. One of the ways that we can also think of with the Gospel of Matthew is we know that he's writing to a primarily Jewish audience, is trying to connect to some of that. And so one of the things then we get is that this Sermon on the Mount is kind of a parallel to Moses giving the law on Mount Sinai. This is then how you should live. If you are God's people, this is how your life should look. All right. And then so as Jesus is saying this, then we also need to remember that God is the standard. But the problem is then also, if we're dealing with being perfectionists, dealing with a variety of things, we live as a comparison to other people's the standard. All right, does that make sense? Yeah. No? All right.
What about parents that compare their children?
Well, that never happens. So,
Your sister's a far point.
right. Yeah.
I guess
But
what
a Christian parent would know that each child has different gifts.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. So you were thinking that way. Certainly.
Those
Yes.
gifts.
Yeah. So yeah, the whole you hold your children to the standards to help them try and be the best version of themselves that they can be, but recognizing that version is going to be different, and so, but then it's easy for them to look around and go, well, shoot, my sister, my brother's better at X than I am, and that makes me feel like a failure, or things like that. But when I first heard you saying that, I was almost thinking, since it's Mother's Day, the flip side of parents trying to being held to this high standard, and I can't live up to the, mothers thinking that they're not a Proverbs 31 woman, they can't do all that. That's a standard I can't keep. My house isn't spotless. My kids aren't well behaved. I'm not spending my extra time, marketing essential oils or selling cloth. I'm not making all my kids' clothes or everything like that.
Human standards.
Right. Again, human standards versus God's standards.
I've raised my children
Right.
to know Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah. What's the standard is? Yeah. What's the most important is that faith, and that forgiveness. So, But yeah, that comparison could be the, what is it say? I'm quite kind of blanking on it. Comparison is the enemy of contentment, to a sense, in a sense that when you're that's
So Pastor,
yeah,
when you said God is the standard and this is
Yeah.
my faith,
yeah.
how's that, when I look at it, that's very difficult to keep that standard.
Yeah.
So can you dwell, could you?
Well, maybe hold on to that thought, and as we go through, we'll see if the rest of this answers your question. All right. And so when in doubt, so again, when we encounter hard sayings of Jesus, look at the context, look at who Jesus is talking to, look at the other teachings around it to see what he's doing, recognizing that sometimes Jesus uses different teaching methods like hyperbole and things. And when in doubt, look at the Greek, which of course you all can do, right? But look at the footnotes in your study Bible or things that can often help. But the Greek word that Matthew uses here, or quoting Jesus, is teleos, which can mean perfect, but also usually means more mature. Right, recognizing that mature is a standard that is meetable, but is not ever necessarily finished, but we'll talk more about that getting into that in a second too. All right. And so some other places that teleos word is used. James uses it in his letter beginning. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So again, perfect, teleos there. And so again, perfect in this sense doesn't mean flawless, it means complete. So be complete as your Father in heaven's complete. Teleos also has to do with arriving at a destination. When Jesus tells us to be perfect as our Father is perfect, he's telling us God's the goal and the destination. Do I have that on?
So is it up to us to complete ourselves?
No, I don't. Well, because the most famous place you hear this telos word is one of Jesus' words on the cross, telestai. I think I'm missing a syllable in there. But when Jesus says, "It is finished," this is the word that he's using, or the word that they record him using in Greek. So it is finished. It is complete. Nothing more is done. Needs to be done. Jesus has done that all. All right. So, any thoughts? Any thoughts, questions, comments before we get into the discussion questions?
Well, we know the standard. We know we fall short.
Yep.
Way short. Not even on the scale.
Right. Yeah, because that's one of the challenges in dealing with. So God's got this high standard in the law. Our two reactions to it generally are either trying to lower the standard. Well, God said that we don't really need to, God said, don't murder. Well, is this really murder? Stealing? Well, this isn't really stealing, is it? Or lust, oh, that's not really adultery. I've heard too much about our president's sex lives in the last 30 years than I ever wanted to. Whether is, or, maybe not be in a situation where a porn star is talking about an encounter on the stand. There's ways to avoid that. But, we can lower the standard. Character counts until it doesn't. Talk about that sometimes with grade inflation and other things. So, so our two reactions are either lower the standard or say, well, that standard's unachievable, so I'm not even going to try. Which in some ways, both those reactions lead to the same destination. But
So what's the difference between moral and spiritual with flawlessness? How's that, because I get confused with,
Yeah, okay.
You know what I mean? Because you just gave an example of the
Yeah.
moral.
right, yeah. So and some of that is God does give some laws we interpret as moral. Some laws that are probably more have more of a spiritual emphasis than a moral emphasis. Some of that plays into those three uses of the law that we've talked about, where the first use is just the guidance, keep general order, society things. Second use is the mirror that shows us our sin, and ultimately that should then point us to Jesus. Then third use is the guide of, how then should we live? Seeing how those different demands for flawlessness and morally and spiritually affect us in those ways. Okay.
I'll think about it.
Yep. No. Think about it. Think about it, and we'll see as we keep talking whether those get answered anymore. All right. Kind of talked about this when we went through that list earlier. Are you a perfectionist? How can you tell? And don't stress about giving a perfect answer. All right. What are the advantages and disadvantages of perfectionism?
There are advantages.
Mary, is that an advantage or disadvantage?
The advantages are attention to details, excellent time management skills, and you're performing your best.
Yeah.
Okay, and you have a sense of purpose, more so than, anyway. But the disadvantages is stress and burnout, and your life isn't normal.
Yeah.
And you don't have good relationships because you're so focused on perfection.
Yep.
Now, I think I'm an overachiever, and if I'm doing something that my gifts are good for, I excel. But I'm not a perfectionist.
Okay. Yep. And it's good to kind of note those differences. So again, advantages for being a perfectionist is that focused on details, on being able to get things done, often having a purpose that you're trying to get it perfect because there's a greater meaning behind what you're doing, the work, but can lead to stress, to burnout, to focus on the work and not a focus on relationships.
It's hard to be
And-
a friend of a
Yes,
perfectionist.
that can be hard to be a friend of a
And
perfectionist.
before you
yes.
know it,
Yep.
social distancing.
But
Yeah.
I don't know. That sounds like psychological analyzing.
Yeah.
And how does that do with the put God in the picture? Like, I always use who am I, who do I belong to, and what is my purpose?
Yep.
That's my measuring stick
Okay. Yeah.
for perfection or anything else. Because as a former athlete, yes, I strive to be perfect in everything that I do. But above that is, who am I doing this for?
Right.
Who am I serving? And it's always God.
Yeah.
So, yes, I'm trying to be the best athlete and boom, boom, boom. But ultimately, I'm trying to hold that shield and that's for God.
Yeah.
You see, so that's, you're talking about nature, nurture.
Well, because I think some of that gets into one of the ways to think about it is that we sometimes shorthand first article gives, that God gives us some of those insights and gives us our reason and other things that we can use to work on things.
I guess what I'm
but I
saying-
also think, too, being an athlete probably gives you a different view on things. I sometimes struggle because I'm a musician,
Right,
more first.
right.
If you're batting 300 as an athlete, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
If I'm hitting 300, if I'm hitting a third of my notes correctly,
Yeah.
people are going to notice.
Yeah, but that's the thing,
But-
what I'm trying to say is that if I don't bat 300, or if I'm not sack city when I'm getting 20 sacks or whatever,
Right, yeah.
okay, do I sit on the curb and go, whoa, you know?
Well, right. I mean, you have to have that ability to. I failed this play. I'm back out there. It's another down. Time to
You're doing the best you
review
can do.
and doing the best you can do.
But I
Right.
think God's perfection for us is He just
I don't
wants
believe
us.
Yeah.
To be perfect for God is
Sorry.
for us to
Well,
depend on God.
and we also have that freedom, and I think too that if Jesus has completed what we need to,
Yeah.
then that gives us more freedom than if I have to do this in order for God to love me.
I think we forget the part about reminding ourselves,
Yeah.
like you said, what is the standard?
Mm-hmm.
Whose standard?
Who's standing? Yep.
God's.
So it's a childhood story about a perfectionist, the little red hen, where she does everything.
The little red hen.
Yeah, she cooks and then no one wants to help her because, she probably can't do it the way she wants it.
Right, yeah.
And it kind of backfires in her face.
Oh,
Yeah, I think that could be that way.
It's one of my favorite books, The Little Red Hen.
All right.
Sometimes, though, the perfectionist isn't the one doing things because they're perfectionists. Perfectionism prevents you from doing things because they can't do it perfectly.
Yeah, okay, and that was one of the questions or comments earlier on too, that, yeah, the perfectionist will some,
The little red hen is more of a workaholic.
it's a what?
workaholic, which overlaps but is not fully perfectionist.
Because a lot of times workaholics aren't perfectionists, they just want to get everything done. And a perfectionist would say, hey, if I'm not doing it totally right, why do it?
I agree. I'm not a workaholic.
I'll vouch for that.
All right, let's move on. Have you struggled with discontentment by comparing your life with others? How do you handle those feelings? No? Oh, yeah, Lois.
Long time ago, yeah.
Yeah. Lois?
There's a
When we were
good
poor,
book
yeah.
written by Hannah Whitehall Smith.
Okay.
God of all comfort and God is enough.
Hmm.
Those are good books to read.
Okay, yeah.
The problem with all that, I have a friend who, on the outside of you, everything looks wonderful,
Hmm.
and yet she's complaining about, I'm retired and so-and-so, they're in Florida part of the time, but we can't do that, yada,
Yep.
yada, yada. It's all kinds of stuff like that, and I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, gosh, she's well and healthy and gets around and the grandkids.
Again, yeah, yep, that's a good example of that comparison, kind of stealing your joy and contentment.
And so it's more about figuring out how to deal whatever it is you're given. I mean, that's part of the teaching of being a Christian is the contentment part. That's one of the Ten Commandments. You shouldn't covet.
Yeah.
That's coveting. That's having an idol.
Yep.
Somebody else has got that, but I don't have it.
Isn't that part of nature though, in a sense? Because a lot of times I like to tell stories of my past, how I felt like a victim, and then how I went through a threshold of change as a child of God. I no longer think like that or feel like that because it depends on what the individual is. Because I guess I'm saying when I sit with people going through hospice, and a lot of time in the conversation, you get that victimization. Why me?
Yep.
This and this. So it depends on what psychological or where they are in their life, maybe. I don't know.
I think so. I think comparison in a lot of circumstances, it will look different in how it affects you, but it's certainly there.
Yeah. Not saying it's not wrong because we have to, in a sense, we have to do those type of things to get to that point, in life and everything. But sometimes it goes, I remember ending with me and the person I was visiting with says, it is what it is. They have a big old smile on their face, but I have Jesus.
There,
You know what I mean? And I was like, oh my goodness, I wasn't going there, but I'm glad you did. You see what I'm
Yep.
saying?
So yeah, sometimes that acceptance again,
Yeah.
not comparing yourself with others, but just seeing how things are for you. All right. How are human standards and God's standards different from each other?
Well, for one thing, ours is, if we're not careful, it's all earthly,
Mhm.
and I'm assuming his are all
Yeah,
eternal.
yeah,
And I have human or self-serving,
Mhm.
prideful.
okay,
It actually separates us from God. God's standards are his commands, his promises, love, joy, peace, eternal life. I like his standards.
yeah. All right, any other thoughts there?
Well, I think human standards, many human standards are based on God's standards.
Okay, yeah. I think ultimately, yeah, they're based on God's standards, yeah. Human standards can be based on God's standards, but we, yeah, tweak them a little bit because we think we know better.
So it's okay to be a human standard perfectionist as long as you don't stray into that judgmental.
Right, I mean, yeah, we haven't talked about that, but that's probably another challenge with either perfectionism or comparison. We haven't talked about the comparison in terms of worrying about how other people are in terms of you not necessarily measuring up to their standards, but the flip side's almost, yeah, can be a challenge too, of being judgmental of, well, you're not up to my standard, and looking down instead of seeing, well, what can be done to
Some parents
get that.
put pressure
Yeah.
on their-
Yeah, the parental pressure to,
Because perfectionism,
Yes.
it's like learned.
Mhm.
You're not born with it.
yeah, I think that's probably that it's
You have
a,
one in your family tree, and they're the ones that's raising you. Chances are you're going to be a perfectionist too.
probably, yeah.
Maybe we'll figure it out like AI. Sorry.
All right, so when you're perfect, you have what you need in God's eyes, is one of the quotes from the chapter. What do you need in God's eyes?
A mature faith.
A mature faith, okay. Anything else? Humility, yep, that's probably a good thing too.
I like the list from Galatians 5 of about 5 maybe. Faithfulness, kindness, peace, joy, happiness.
The fruits of the Spirit, yeah.
Right.
Okay. Or fruit of the Spirit, yeah.
I would say, always be curious.
Being curious, okay, yep. They're all good answers. You're kind of missing the big one, but
What's the big?
like my college kids or sometimes confirmation kids will go, Jesus.
Jesus, yeah.
You know, that, what do you need? You got, again, Jesus completed the work, his work that needed to be done for us. So it kind of goes along with the mature faith in Jesus. That's what we need in God's eyes. All right, and then, yeah. What does it mean to you to know that Jesus' work was finished on the cross? And same root word for perfect, mature, complete, finished. Relief, yeah.
You know
Yep.
where our soul's going.
It means everything.
All right, any other thoughts, questions, comments? Did I answer all your questions, Mary?
So is a perfectionist is a sinful person?
Well, I mean, we're all sinful
I mean,
people, so.
A whole different realm of sin.
I think perfectionism, like most things, could be good, but it's like sin twists good intentions and good things into sinfulness that leads us away from God.
I don't know, I never thought of being perfect, but
No.
I'm an aggressive achiever. Is that the definition?
Over.
Culver, I think they're similar, but
So let's
Different,
say
yeah.
you're, off the chart perfectionist, and you go get maybe Christian counseling, or you get some kind of therapy. Can you be reprogrammed?
Probably, I think like any bad habit,
fall
bad
back like an
thing of thought.
alcoholic?
Oh, probably, yeah. I mean, again, well, it's like when I do premarital counseling, a lot of what we talk about is kind of recognizing that they're coming from two different families and that so have different default ways of doing things. And that's, even as they're trying to create their new family, then they go through their married life together, that one of the big tension points is going to be where those kind of default settings, so to speak, bump up against each other and don't match up. Which could be as little, in as little things of, how do you fold?
Bath towels.
Okay, loading the dishwasher is the other big one. But yeah, folding the towels is, do you fold them? Yeah, 2 ways, 3 ways.
But
Big way first
thankfully,
response,
houses
but-
have evolved. We had one bathroom upstairs when we were growing up, and then Dad
Yeah.
had one in the basement. But the thing is, when you each have your own bathroom, then I don't care how your towels are. I'm not going in there and looking at them.
But yeah, and so we all have from our family of origin, we have our default settings that how we think things should be done. And we're spending now our life together with someone who's from a different family, who has different assumptions, different things. And so you work and you figure that out, but you still will sometimes, especially, in moments of tiredness and stress and things, fall back into those patterns. And that happens within individuals too, of you're this way. You may have fixed or corrected or worked to overcome XYZ bad thought pattern, bad whatever, but that you can, it sometimes takes work to get in that new pattern.
I have a question about context.
Okay, what's your question about context,
Well,
Ron?
your first question was who was he? Who was God?
Yeah, who is Jesus talking to? When in doubt, look at the context.
Yeah, the context. So
Yep.
are you saying the context of the historical, who they were talking about in the period of time and how we relate that to us today? Or what?
Well, so when we're looking at the words of Jesus, we're looking at, at the people that he is talking to. Sermon on the Mount, he is teaching a crowd of disciples, students who are following him around as he's their teacher, and at least some open. So Jesus is going to interact with them in a different way than when the scribes and the Pharisees are showing up to question him, to talk to him, to try and trip him up, to try and get him in trouble.
Did you just feed them?
No, he hasn't fed them yet.
So I guess.
But so that's kind of that context is in one sense. In another sense, it's the context of what's going on within the gospel. Recognizing that Matthew is focusing his story on these things. Luke is telling his story of Jesus, focusing on those things and recognizing some of how that interacts.
So is there a context that we can reference in the Old Testament?
And that's kind of in the context too. Like I said, Matthew, sometimes they'll make it real explicit in the gospel. They'll say, Jesus did this thing because the prophet said this, or Jesus said this and quoted this passage in order to explain what he was doing. Sometimes it's subtler. Like Jesus is teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching on a mountain. Moses taught on a mountain and gave the law. So you have that context, so to speak, that people who knew the Old Testament would have picked up on that.
So when we look at the context and we look at the scripture like that, how can I say this? How can we relate it to us today? Because sometimes we fill in the blanks when he wasn't really talking about that. You see?
Right. So he was talking to those people, but it's been recorded down so that we can hear it too. But yeah, we're certainly approaching it in different ways, and so we might bring in some of our own biases and hear things he's not saying.
Okay.
That's certainly a challenge because we're dealing with, 2,000 years and a couple language changes.
And that makes a
Shift in
difference.
between.
Does it
Oh, it
make a
does.
difference? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, but
No,
let's
this
say
is why I had to take a whole class on interpreting the Bible called hermeneutics
Yeah.
in seminary and read this big thick book called What Does This Mean? That we'd sometimes add an extra adjective or two in the title, depending on how frustrated we were with explaining, wondering what it meant.
That was pretty good. I think I like.
But yeah, no, that recognizing that idea of, who it's talking to, who it's writing to, how we read it, who, and you can get really into the weeds in that. You can go off in some weird directions, trying to do that sort of thing too. Again, depending on the biases and assumptions you bring in, but
to overcome those biases, what I try to do is, if God's voice isn't the loudest one in my head, then I've got to get rid of
Yep.
those other voices.
yeah,
Is that like
So
naysayers? Is that what you mean?
no, I mean just any distractions or different things. Again, there's very good things that can be distorted and misinterpreted that be misunderstood.
That goes back to, remember the phase, what would Jesus do bracelets?
Yep.
So it's like everything that was going to happen in your life, what would Jesus do?
Right, and so when I encounter a situation, the answer, what would Jesus do? And ultimately that's it was based on a sermon series from a pastor trying to convince his congregation in Wichita to rethink that, and in that you have someone giving up riches to go work in the poor. The hardware store owner gives up some of his money to treat his workers fairly. The railroad employee who could be complicit in a corruption scheme decides to be honest about it. That's how they answer this question of what would Jesus do. But again, also can become a really good a good thought that can get misinterpreted and misunderstood, and start thinking different things. And of course, recognizing too, I think I show that usually. There's a picture of Jesus throwing over tables, clearing the temple, and said, when asking yourself what would Jesus do, always remember, throwing tables is an option. Usually not the best option. That we get one specific example of Jesus doing that, a lot more examples of him doing other things. But
Pastor, I threw a table once and I got fired. No, I'm
right.
a coach.
Yep.
Going through this.
Oh yeah.
Don't you
Right.
like that.
Yep.
Okay, so I Googled
Uh-oh.
what part of Christianity has the most perfectionists.
Yeah.
And it kind of is a sect off of the Methodist Church. It's the traditional Quaker.
Oh, huh.
They are the
Interesting.
most perfectionist people.
Okay, but yeah, I mean, and there are, I mean, that's one of the challenges too when hearing this verse that we started off looking at, "Be perfect as my Father is perfect." There's a tradition in some Christian groups that leads to perfection, that we can be perfectly holy flawless this side of eternity. Fortunately, for us Lutherans, we recognize that, well, yeah, I'm 100% sane, I'm perfectly holy, but I'm also, I'm a sinner too. Right, and that's by grace, and I'm perfectly a sinner. My old Adam needs to be drowned every morning. I need to come to Jesus for forgiveness all the time because I'm sinning, because I've got these two things in me. Then the Holy Spirit is working in me to make me more holy. But that process of sanctification will not be completed until, we get to heaven or Jesus comes again. So, all righty. Well, why don't we'll wrap up there and we'll keep going next week. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Have a perfect week.
Have a
Perfection.
You're on your way there. You're not there yet, but